It's time to eat.
What are you hungry for?
Sit down and get ready to consume an abundance of fantasy football knowledge from Ross Tucker and Joe Dolan.
Feed me now. I'm starving.
On the Fantasy Feast Eatin' Podcast.
Yeah, let's eat, baby. It is the Fantasy Feast Eatin' Podcast. It's presented by DraftKings, which is the best place to play some DFS this weekend. Really looking forward to that. One of my favorite things to do this time of year, actually. I am at Ross Tucker NFL on social media. The former NFL offensive lineman. We had Mike Lombardi, former NFL GM, on today's Ross Tucker Football Podcast. So encourage you to check that out for sure. We also had an awesome Even Money betting podcast yesterday for those of you that are into that. College Draft Podcast. We're getting all of you, especially those of you whose teams are out of it, ready for the NFL draft. This show changes a little bit this time of year. I usually say it's the show that's so nice, we do it twice. Not anymore. It's only once a week until week 1 of the 2023 NFL regular season, when we'll go back to 2 episodes. We still, though, are breaking down the games like only Joe Dolan can. We still are diving into the fantasy implications, especially from a DFS perspective. But we always like to say the way you really get better at fantasy football is the offseason, is learning the processes, strategies, as opposed to just tuning in during the season. It's like, all right, Joe, just give me the answers to the question. Who should I play? Who should I not play? Who should start? Joe, of course, is from fantasypoints.com, where you should use the code 22feast because he is the man, and fantasypoints.com is awesome. Love all those guys over there. John Hansen, Graham, Scott, they're awesome. And then you can follow me on social media at Ross Tucker NFL and us at Ross Tucker Pod. I'll tell you this, for at Ross Tucker Pod on Twitter or Instagram or even Facebook now, and or youtube.com/Ross Tucker NFL. Doesn't Jack do a great job with the highlight clips of the show? Joe, you and I were just talking about it.
I really like it. He makes me sound good. If you talk for an hour, Ross, you're going to say something stupid, and he manages to you guys manage to pick out the stuff that doesn't sound so dumb. So I appreciate that.
It is perfect. Love the highlight clips. So the way it works, just so everybody knows, if you ever see me looking down or typing, I am making a note of the time and kind of paraphrasing what Joe says that I find interesting. And I send that to Jack so that Jack can cut the clip and post on social media, because I think I'm pretty good at if I think it's really interesting and noteworthy what Joe says, then I think other people will too. So those are the clips that I want to cut and post on social media so that hopefully people are interested in it, and then more people check out all of our content, including this show. All right, so Joe, we got 6 games to go over. It's wild card weekend. Just give me the big picture fantasy-wise, primarily DraftKings, but really anywhere, because I know a lot of people kind of shift into a different mode now for the playoffs from a fantasy perspective.
Yeah, so there's obviously multiple ways you can play fantasy in the playoffs. There's a couple of contests that I'm in where you can only pick one player from every team to fill a lineup requirement. The FFPC does that. Which is a high stakes fantasy website, and it gets really strategic, because you're like, well, if I use Patrick Mahomes, I can't use Travis Kelce, and that site's tight end premium, so I really want to use Travis Kelce. But if I use Christian McCaffrey, I can't use Deebo Samuel. If I use Deebo Samuel, I can't use Christian McCaffrey. If I use AJ Brown, I can't use Jalen Hurts. So you have to really think through that while also managing to come up with what could be a unique lineup that can win the contest. Obviously, DFS, it's the same, just with a smaller player pool. So you're going to get down into players that you typically wouldn't use for a DFS lineup. There's a contest that I run for my buddies that's called that's called the one and done. And what that is you set a lineup every week But the catch is you can't use a player more than once throughout the playoffs. You have the entire player pool available to you, but if you use Josh Allen here in Wild Card Weekend, you can't use Josh Allen the next week, the week after that, and it becomes very difficult because you have to make sure you have players who advance to the Super Bowl when the scoring is doubled. So there's really a lot of strategies. There's a lot of fun ways to play. For us, for our purposes with this podcast, because it's so short, you can't really get into all the ways, like breaking down, well, you can use them in this, but you can't use them in that. What I can talk about is the projected game flow of the games, what some of the player props are, who are expected to be the big time performers in these contests.
We'll start, Joe, with Saturday afternoon then. And it's the Seattle Seahawks against the 49ers. The total's 42.5, which interestingly is the second lowest total of the weekend. That surprises me a little bit.
Well, I think part of the reason for that is the fact that Seattle went 0-2 in this matchup this year. Geno Smith managed to put 20 points on the board totally through one touchdown in these two games. And they met just 4 weeks ago back in week 15. And Geno went 31 of 44 in that game, but for just 238 yards. Tyler Lockett had 7 catches for 68. DK Metcalf had 7 for 55. So the Seahawks had a lot of problems. Kenneth Walker in that game had 79 yards from scrimmage. The Seahawks had a lot of problems just moving the ball with any consistency in that game. Meanwhile, Brock Purdy, the 49ers were efficient in that game. Christian McCaffrey touched the ball 32 times. George Kittle scored 2 touchdowns. So those are the players who are really, really standing out to me. If I'm looking at player props, Christian McCaffrey is expected to gain 112 yards from scrimmage in this game. Kenneth Walker is expected to gain 71 yards from scrimmage, which is kind of right where he was. I might consider some unders for Tyler Lockett at 60.5 and DK Metcalf at 62.5. The Seahawks obviously are pretty heavy underdogs in this game. I think it was 10 at some points. I think 9.5 is where it's at right now. And based on how these games went earlier in this season, I completely understand it. The 49ers dominated this matchup. The question I have about the 49ers, and I am not trying to say Brock Purdy isn't playing well, because he is. What will they look like if and when Brock Purdy has to play from behind against one of these playoff teams? And I think that's an open-ended question. I just don't know if I anticipate San Francisco playing from behind in this game. One thing to note for San Francisco, because Deebo Samuel has returned to the lineup, the markets really don't know what to do with these receivers. Brandon Ayuk is the favorite to lead this team in receiving at 45.5 yards, but Deebo Samuel and George Kittle has been Brock Purdy's boy. He scored 5 touchdowns the last month. George Kittle is the guy who they don't really know what to do with. 42.5, he has the same yardage line as Deebo Samuel. I don't know. I think that might be a little low for George Kittle based on how well he and Brock Purdy have been clicking so far.
The Chargers face off against the Jaguars on Saturday night. The total is 47.5. And I guess it kind of feels, Joe, like there's the potential to be a lot of points in this one. I think we're all thinking Saturday night. Trevor Lawrence, Justin Herbert, they both got the surfer hair. They just come out chucking it all over the place, man. Let's score a lot of points and have fun, dude. I think there's a lot of people that kind of think that that's the possibility. Or is that what you're envisioning?
Yeah. What makes this game interesting is the fact that the Chargers are coming off a loss, and I'm sure you've had the discussion on the Ross Tucker Football Podcast this week. Brandon Staley playing the starters and Mike Williams getting hurt and having to be helped to the team bus at the end of the game. Ross, did you ever have back spasms?
Oh, yeah.
So what does it feel like? How long does it take to get over them?
It's as painful as anything you can experience. And it's usually better the next day.
Yeah.
You can even get to calm down later that day, but it's usually better the next day. What I would say, though, is there's usually an underlying issue
Yeah.
with the back spasm, but that usually doesn't, in my experience, that usually doesn't start to rear its ugly head until later, right? So, like, a lot of times guys have a back spasm and it's like, oh, okay. Yeah, go to a chiropractor or calm down. But it's like a year later where you start to hear about a bulging disc or a herniated disc or whatever. But I don't think any of that's a factor. I would imagine that's probably not the case.
Yeah.
For Mike Williams in terms of this Saturday. It sounds like, and I saw Dr. Chow from Sports Injury Central that they think that Mike Williams will be fine this Saturday, which I thought was interesting.
There's still no receiving prop for Mike Williams up at DraftKings Sportsbook, which is understandable. What is his status? Is he going to be able, to get some practices in and all that stuff? So I find that absolutely fascinating. And then, I don't know if I have a great read on this game overall, Ross. I saw Rashawn Slater activated from his Windows activated, but he's not going to play this week for the Chargers, who, by the way, are 2-point favorites in this game. I could consider myself maybe a little wager on the Jaguars because the Chargers to me are a very Jekyll and Hyde team. I wouldn't be so stunned if the Chargers make a run to the AFC Championship game. I don't know if the Jaguars have that kind of upside, but I also wouldn't be stunned if the Jaguars just take care of business at home and drop it on the Chargers in this game. The guy who I'm really looking for, and I expect to be very popular in DFS and in one-and-done contests, is Travis Etienne because of that Chargers run defense. And Travis Etienne, the thing that's fascinating about him to me is when they drafted him last year, they still had James Robinson. And now, obviously, we know what happened with the Urban Meyer fiasco. But I think everybody anticipated, Travis Etienne, Trevor Lawrence, in college, these two guys hooked up a lot in the receiving game, and he's going to be, a great scat bag. He might be similar to Austin Eckler in terms of usage. Etienne hasn't caught more than 3 passes in a game all season, which is fascinating to me. And because of that, his rushing yards prop is really high. It's 75.5. But that stands out to me because I think that is where the Jaguars are going to probably want to attack the Chargers. I don't think Trevor Lawrence played particularly well last week against the Titans in that game. The defensive score that sends the Jaguars to the playoffs. So in this game, I'm expecting Travis Etienne to be a huge factor for the Jaguars. I'm expecting Austin Eckler out of the backfield, especially if Mike Williams can't play or is limited in this game. Keenan Allen to be a huge factor for the Chargers. And obviously, I think Christian Kirk, Zay Jones, these guys are going to have more of an impact than they had a couple of weeks ago, maybe against Houston, because I think Trevor Lawrence is going to play better in this game. But Travis Etienne is really the guy who stands out in this matchup. And there should be an opportunity for Travis Etienne to get in the box, if not once, if not twice, maybe once. But I think two touchdowns is in the realm of possibility for Travis Etienne against this Charger run defense and with this high total. But yes, the high total, they're expecting them to come out and throw around the yard. Justin Herbert on prime time. I'm more excited to watch this game. I don't really have a great feel for it from a fantasy or betting perspective, quite frankly.
I tend to agree. I'm kind of thinking that it was the Jags Super Bowl last Saturday night and that the Chargers kind of bounced back, but it's not easy. I mean, they were in Denver, fly back to LA, now all the way to Jacksonville, short week. Not ideal. You know what else isn't ideal, by the way, Joe? How often we all have subscriptions that we're paying for and we forget about them. It's not okay. Rocket Money, formerly known as Truebill, is a personal finance app that finds and cancels your unwanted subscriptions, monitors your spending, and helps you lower your bills all in one place. This is amazing, by the way. You can find a subscription in your Rocket Money app, press cancel, and Rocket Money will cancel it for you. That is amazing. Over 80% of people, by the way, have subscriptions they forget about. So this is key, especially if you got a lot of different streaming services and stuff. Big fan of Rocket Money. I can't believe that you can save money just by clicking a button. Stop throwing your money away. cancel the unwanted subscriptions, and manage your expenses the easy way by going to rocketmoney.com/feast. That's rocketmoney.com/feast. I know it's a New Year's resolution for a lot of you. Do it via rocketmoney.com/feast. We move on to Sunday, Joe, the game I'll be at, calling for Westwood 1. It's the Dolphins at the Bills, and the total is 47. There's been quite a bit of line movement, 1.5 Joe. Did I miss something coming out somewhere that suggested Tua's going to play?
Well, I'm not sure it's going to be Tua, but the Dolphins posted a playoff hype video an hour ago, and Teddy Bridgewater is in it. And I think that's probably enough to move the line a point and a half off of Skylar Thompson. I don't know if Tua's going to go. That's obviously a huge question about this game. I don't think Tua's going to go. The optics, not great, but maybe they're welcoming in the possibility that Tua could play. Obviously, if Tua plays, that's great news for the Dolphins. I'm not sure it's great news for the NFL if Tua plays in this game. But Teddy is going to make them, in theory, more competitive than Skylar Thompson would in this game. In theory, Teddy's had some good years. Teddy's had some bad years. Teddy's had some good games. Teddy's had some bad games. Right now, though the line has moved to 9, there are no Dolphins player props out there. So everybody is waiting on quarterback news. Obviously, if Teddy plays or Tua plays, Tyreek Hill, Jalen Waddle become much stronger plays than they would with Skylar Thompson or Mike Glennon at quarterback. Now, Waddle and Hill are both kind of dinged up. And that's another question here. I will say this, in the FFPC playoff contest, which is one and done, you have to pick 2 teams to fully fade, meaning you not one and done, it's 1 player per team. You have to pick 2 teams to fully fade because there's only 12 lineup spots, and you have to pick 2 teams where you pick a kicker and a defense. I'm actually using the Dolphins defense in that contest because even though I think the Bills are going to win, and I think they're going to win relatively easily, we have seen Josh Allen take sacks. We have seen Josh Allen turn the ball over. I think they could get to Allen a couple of times and still lose this game for Miami. But right now, the quarterback situation is up in the air. Raheem Mostert, we don't know about his availability. That's up in the air. He's got a broken thumb. So there are no player props whatsoever on the Miami Dolphins. And quite frankly, we've got to wait until we get some solid quarterback news. The line movement would suggest that people are hearing things that suggest Skylar Thompson will not start in this game.
What about the Bills offensively? You mentioned the Miami Dolphins defense. Anything in particular on the Bills offensively?
Yeah, so I think this is a game for Buffalo. You know, we saw them play 2 games this year already. We saw them play basically in extreme conditions. We saw them play in that dead heat in Miami, and then we saw them play in the snow in Buffalo in Week 15, that most recent matchup. And in that most recent matchup, Josh Allen was awesome. Josh Allen played maybe his best game of the year, throwing for 4 touchdowns. We saw the 4 touchdowns, by the way, in that game from Josh Allen went to James Cook, Dawson Knox, Quentin Morris, and Nyheim Hines. Believe that or not. Stephon Diggs had just 5 catches for 60 yards. Gabriel Davis had 4 for 56 because, you know, Miami pretty strong at the corner position with Xavier Howard. But I expect Buffalo to come out and do what Buffalo does. I think they're probably going to run the ball a little bit more in this game than maybe they have all season, just because Allen's had a little bit of struggles recently. But they could also look to the fact that Allen was great in their last matchup, throwing for 4 touchdowns. Allen, 253.5 is the passing yardage prop on him. Devin Singletary and James Cook, I find this notable. Their rushing props have narrowed. Devin Singletary is at 43.5. Cook's at 37.5. Don't be surprised if James Cook is the breakout playoff star for the Buffalo Bills with his increased usage of late.
Ooh, I like that one, Joe. What about the Giants and the Vikings?
Giants are going to be a very popular underdog bet. I can tell you that right now. They are still at 3, though, so that line hasn't moved. I think a lot of public money is probably coming in on the Giants, but there must be enough big money that is sticking with the Vikings for that line to have not moved off the 48.5 being the total in this game. And I just think everybody's opinion has just completely collapsed on the Vikings. You know, they came out last week and they put together a couple of nice drives in that game against the Bears, but they still made some mistakes. Dalvin Cook fumbling. Dalvin Cook got dinged up in that game. But I think the Vikings, talent-wise, are the better of these teams. The Giants might be better coached and might be playing better at this particular moment. Let's see the information on the Giants injury report, because Adoree Jackson would be a very huge get for them against Justin Jefferson. You know, they've had a lot of injuries in that secondary, and I think that's part of maybe the number one reason Brian Daboll rested starters last week against the Eagles was because not just because the Giants had nothing to play for, but the fact that they had been one of the more injured teams in the entire NFL up to this point. So to get Saquon Barkley some rest, to get some of those injured defensive players and injured offensive linemen some rest was really important for the Giants. So they're going to be coming into this game as strong as they possibly can at this point. So I think the Giants made the right decision last week. Looking at some of the player props here, their receivers, they're expecting this to be a three-headed monster here. You've got Darius Slayton at 51.5, Richie James at 47.5. You've got Isaiah Hodgins at 43.5. So they're not really sure what to do with those guys. Richie James has really kind of been Daniel Jones's go-to guy, and that might be the guy I gravitate to in DFS lineups this week for the New York Giants, outside of Saquon Barkley, of course. But Richie James has really been kind of the guy for that Daniel Jones has really loved throwing the football to.
And the Vikings, Joe?
Yeah, so the Minnesota Vikings, thankfully, are the Minnesota Vikings. They're still the team that we know loves to pump the ball to its elite options. Now, I'm looking at the Giants' points allowed to particular positions over the last 5 weeks. They're basically a league average matchup for tight ends by their points allowed versus opponents. It's adjusted for a strength of schedule as well. So the Giants are about league average in that regard. And TJ Hawkinson has just been a star ever since he's gotten to the Vikings. 47.5 yards on his player prop is way too low for me. I think TJ Hawkinson goes up and above that number. Justin Jefferson's at 90.5. I mean, yeah, if Adoree Jackson doesn't play in this game, I think there's a really good chance that that Justin Jefferson goes up and above that. Dalvin Cook at 71.5 when he limped off the field last week. I'm a little iffy on that, but the Minnesota Vikings remain the Minnesota Vikings. They're going to pump the ball to their good guys. If Kirk Cousins plays well, they're going to win this game. I don't think the markets have a whole lot of confidence in Kirk Cousins. At least the public doesn't have a whole lot of confidence in Kirk Cousins. I expect the Giants to be a very public dog in this game.
Ravens at the Bengals. I don't really understand this, Joe. Yesterday on the Even Money podcast, when I think most of us thought Lamar was going to play, the line was 6.5. Now that Ian Rappaport, shortly before we started the show, said it's not looking good for Lamar, the line's only 7, Joe. So was it already kind of baked in that people were skeptical of Lamar playing?
I think that line's too short, quite frankly. Yeah, that's my first read on the situation. Look, Tyler Huntley, he did some good things last year. There's no doubt about it. But last year's Baltimore team was like more talented at the receiver position than this one. It's Mark Andrews has had some ups and downs. This is really bad. At fantasypoints.com, we did our staff predictions, and all of us, well, based on averages, we've actually projected the Bengals to play the most games in this playoff because There was a handful of us, myself included, who picked the Bengals to go to the Super Bowl. There were a handful of us, every single one of us picked them to win this game. So from a total point standpoint, a total fantasy point standpoint, I think I'd be leaning on Bengals if I have a contest that you calculate the most fantasy points from the wild card round through the Super Bowl, because I think the Bengals have a good shot to make it to the AFC Championship game, if not go back to the Super Bowl. And I think part of that begins with the fact that I think they're going to win this game, especially if it's Tyler Huntley at quarterback. The Ravens are well coached. They're tough. They have way too many injuries, and they are too deficient of talent on offense for me to really get excited about them from a fantasy standpoint. By the way, there are no Ravens player props out for obvious reasons. They don't even have anybody I'm interested in from a fantasy perspective. They are one of the two teams I fully faded in my FFPC contest. I guess J.K. Dobbins is usable. Remember, Gus Edwards picked up a concussion last week. So J.K. Dobbins is probably going to be a guy who, if anybody's popular for the Ravens and DFS, it's going to be him. But this is a team that I fully faded in my DFS contest, and I have no regrets about that.
The Bengals on the other side?
Yeah, the Bengals I am fully on board with. Jamar Chase, obviously, I think is you can make an argument that Jamar Chase could be like the top overall fantasy player in playoff drafts. I think depending on what you're scoring and what your format is, quarterbacks go very early in playoff fantasy drafts. But in terms of skill position players, it's Jamar Chase, Christian McCaffrey are kind of the top two guys. And both of them have a claim to the throne this year. Joe Mixon's rushing yards prop, by the way, is at 46.5 in this game. So they expect the Bengals to come out, throw the ball around. Joe Burrow's yardage prop, 274.5. I think Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase are going to be very, very chalky DFS stacks in this matchup.
Let's move on to Monday Night Football, Joe. It's the Cowboys. It's the Bucks. The total's 45.5.
This opened at 3, and we've got the Brady bump down to 2.5. Now it's 2.5 on DraftKings plus 100. So that suggests potentially a move back to 3. Again, in terms of markets collapsing on teams, you saw what happened to the Cowboys last week. That was as bad a game as Dak Prescott has played, maybe in his entire career. He led the NFL in interceptions despite missing 5 games. And then I think a lot of people have started to notice, really outside of CeeDee Lamb, they don't really have a whole lot at receiver for Dak Prescott. And Prescott's making bad decisions. He's making bad throws. And all of a sudden they're going on the road to, Brady's washed and he's going to retire or he's going to go to Vegas. Does the old man have one more trick up his sleeve? And I think that's what a lot of people are thinking right now. Now, from a fantasy perspective, I think Chris Godwin is just like the Buccaneers passing game. 274.5 is the line for Tom Brady in this game. And, Brady, it's been like pulling teeth for the guy to get to that number this year. But we know that the Cowboys secondary is extremely exploitable. And if you protect Tom Brady, he's going to pick this secondary apart. And I don't know if I necessarily buy into it, Ross. You have more insight to this in this regard than I do. Jason Garrett said that playing on natural grass slows down the Cowboys pass rush. Do you think there's any validity to that?
Maybe a little bit, but not much.
So
I don't think that's a huge factor. I mean, maybe a little bit. It's not as fast as a turf field. I think there's a little bit to that, but I don't think that's a huge factor.
So then the other factor would be, what does the Buccaneers practice report look like in terms of their offensive linemen? They've had a bunch of injuries there. Reports that Ryan Jensen could play would be probably a huge help to the Buccaneers offensive linemen. Like, I think him going down early, was one of the harbingers of doom for this Buccaneer team that just limped into the playoffs because they play in the worst division in the league. So if that offensive line is starting to look a little bit healthier on the practice reports, which will come out tomorrow because they don't play until Monday, then I think that suggests that Tom Brady, Chris Godwin, and Mike Evans could really go nuts in this game because this is a Dallas team you can throw on. We saw Sam Howell making throws. We saw Gardner Minshew making throws a couple of weeks ago. And those guys ain't Tom Brady. Say what you want about Brady and say what you want about this team this year. Those guys ain't Brady. So I like the Buccaneer passing game in this matchup. Rachaad White, by the way, actually carries a higher rushing yards prop than Leonard Fournette, 40.5 to 36.5, while Fournette carries the higher receiving yards prop, which we typically like for fantasy better because it means more points in PPR, which DraftKings is, 29.5 to 15.5. But Godwin at 68.5. We've got Evans at 63.5. The markets expect the Buccaneers to be able to throw the football in this game. The other question I have from a fantasy perspective, do the Cowboys go away from Ezekiel Elliott, who has really started to, I thought he was playing pretty well early in the season. He started to slow down. He's at 3 yards per carry over the past month. He still carries a higher rushing yards prop than Tony Pollard. If I could find this somewhere, I'd bet Tony Pollard to outrush Ezekiel Elliott straight up in this game.
At FG_Dolan on Twitter, that's where you find my guy, Joe Dolan. I'm at Ross Tucker NFL. We are at Ross Tucker Pod, and you are now ready to go for Super Wildcard Weekend with Joe's breakdowns from a fantasy perspective. Hope you're as stuffed as I am. Have a great weekend, everybody. Greg Cosell on tomorrow's Ross Tucker Football Podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Fantasy Feast podcast. Make sure to also subscribe to the Ross Tucker Football Podcast, Even Money, Business of Sports, and the College Draft. All available at Apple Podcasts, rosstucker.com, or wherever podcasts can be found.